I am one of the reporters for the Financial Times in Brussels, and it's my pleasure to be here with you, everyone watching, and with a great panel of guests to talk about transatlantic digital relationships. I think it's a pretty timely, a very opportune time to have this conversation. Being in Brussels for the last couple of months, the transatlantic relationship, some of the geopolitics around the transatlantic relationship have definitely burst into view, and anyone who's been following the FT's coverage in Brussels and the US would know that. We also meet around 2 or 3 weeks after the inaugural Trade and Technology Council, which was hosted in Pittsburgh, which is a new format and probably the most concrete sort of results to have come out of EU-US relations in the last couple of months after the summit in the summer with President Biden. It's a format we'll be discussing with some of the panelists today about what happens next with the future of some of the working groups that have come out of the TTC, what the participants want to see as results from the TTC model, and also perhaps some of the stumbling blocks, perhaps some resistance, some regulatory divergences between the two sides, and of course the issue of China. These are all topics that I hope we will get into today. We have just over an hour and 15 minutes. And before I introduce the first speakers, just a bit of housekeeping. For all of you who are listening in, I think you can also communicate with each other, so the participants and the viewers can network with each other on their own platform. I'll also be taking questions from the audience, so anyone who wants to get in some queries to our panelists, please write in your questions. It will be great to sort of incorporate them in the debate rather than just waiting at the end. So if there's something pressing which comes up and you'd like one of the speakers to address, I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A. I think that's about it for the housekeeping. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our guests. We are going to begin with, I guess, the two politicians, or at least the two practitioners in the room that could tell us about what they want from the TTC and also some of the political direction the EU is setting for the transatlantic relationship. And we will begin with Maria Gabriel, who is the European Union's now, I think, in her 1.5 term mandate at the European Commission, because she also served under the Juncker Commission, but now is Commissioner for Innovation. Maria, you'll give us a couple of introductory statements, and then we'll also move on to the Minister, who'll give us some introductory remarks too. And then just the format, I'll also open it up to the panelists to give some comments and commentary on what they've heard, and then we'll get into some of the specifics and some of the I think the hot topics of this debate. So, Commissioner, the floor is yours. Why don't you set up this debate today?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. First, allow me to start by warmly thanking the organizers and the Slovenian Presidency for inviting me. I'm myself an alumni of EU40, and it is always a pleasure to be part of your events. Well, I think that we are all aware that we are at a defining moment for Europe and for the US to face the challenges ahead of us, from the recovery of the pandemic to the twin transition, green and digital, to energy prices. And these challenges can only be met if you work together with a spirit of reciprocity. And allow me to start setting the scene with the example of our existing good collaboration before moving into the future of our collaboration in research and innovation. Well, first, the best example is the participation of US organizations on Horizon 2020. In the period 2014 to 2020, US is our most successful and active partner in Horizon 2020 with nearly 2,000 participations in projects. And it's extremely important because these participations allowed US researchers to share in European results. And I think that we can build on this very solid base. Now, allow me to turn to provide a glance of the main lines that will shape our future collaboration. First, we recently adopted a communication on the global approach to research and innovation. It sets out a vision, a policy framework, and an action plan for Europe's international engagement in research and innovation. And in this context, we would like to establish win-win international innovation partnerships consisting of networks of incubators and accelerators with countries and regions that offer reciprocal openness to entrepreneurship and investment. And we'll also welcome overseas innovators to establish startups in the EU and apply for European Innovation Council support, both in terms of equity investments as well as business support. And in addition to that, the European Institute of Innovation and Technology will launch coordinated actions of its knowledge and innovation communities. There is already an existing EIT community hub in Silicon Valley that is working closely with the Bay Area Council to favor that the innovation ecosystems at both sides of the ocean can work together. And in this context, with the US, our policy agenda includes the area of innovation as key priority for cooperation within the context of the TTC. And for example, in the TTC Working Group on Climate and Clean Tech, research and innovation could support standard settings and certification for the new generation of innovators and startups that are working on the new sources of energy, such as hydrogen or deep geothermal energy. Another example is mission innovation. Mission innovation is a great example of the EU and the US working alongside with another international partners. It will catalyze a decade of action and investment in research, development, and demonstration, making clean energy affordable, attractive, and accessible for all. And during COP26, the Commission will sign the Memorandum of Understanding for our contribution to the Catalyst program as an example of international collaboration for clean energy innovation. So yes, we need to connect our European and US innovation ecosystems to be able to have a significant impact, not only on transatlantic trade, but on the global market in a context of emerging competing regions from Asia in terms of innovation and startups. We need to set the global agenda together. And to conclude, and before opening the floor to the discussion, I would like to encourage the transatlantic actors in research and innovation to make their voices heard on what are their expectations in this domain for EU-US relations. Thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and also for highlighting, I think, some parts of the transatlantic relationship on innovation, which probably get a little bit less attention than the sort of the bigger headlines about trade and the TTC. We're going to go next to Mark Boris Andrijenic, who is Slovenia's Minister for the Digital Transformation. Slovenia is the holder of the rotating presidency, but Mark couldn't actually be with us today. He has, however, sent in a recorded message to give us his opening remarks. So if we could now play that, that would be brilliant.
Dear Commissioner and other distinguished guests, my dear fellow transatlanticists, I would like to congratulate the EU40 not only for organizing today's wonderful event, but also for choosing an auspicious date for it. On this day, 240 years ago, General George Washington achieved a major victory that ended the American Revolution and assured America's independence. As we all know, the United States and Europe have been bound by common values and economic interests ever since. For generations, the transatlantic partnership has been a foundation of the rules-based international order, as well as peace, freedom, and prosperity in much of the world. As it is in the case of any family, we have had our fair share of ups and downs, but we remain close cousins, if not brothers. Europe has much to learn from the US when it comes to creating an environment that breeds cutting-edge innovation and global digital champions. Europe, on the other hand, has much to offer when it comes to forward-looking tech regulations and standards, ranging from privacy to digital markets and AI. We can only build more competitive, inclusive, and democratic societies by promoting a consumer-centric and trustworthy approach to all things digital. We simply need comprehensive yet smart regulations of digital markets and services to ensure fair competition, safeguard our core values, and foster innovation. But due to the global nature of today's digital space, these objectives can only be achieved by working closely together with like-minded partners and allies. That is why the Slovenian Presidency strongly supports the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, The TTC offers a much-needed platform that is both comprehensive and solution-oriented. We were delighted and encouraged by the good news coming from the first meeting in Pittsburgh late last month. And we remain optimistic about achieving tangible progress on reducing trade barriers, developing compatible regulatory standards, ensuring supply chain security, and strengthening research collaboration. Of course, the EU and the US will never agree on every detail, but there is no alternative to transatlantic partnership, especially in the light of shared strategic challenges. As was said so many times since the American Revolution, united we stand, divided we fall.
Thank you very much. That was a nice short intervention. We are going to open up the floor, and before we do that, I will introduce the panel. We have 5 very esteemed guests, and we beginning with Peter Harrell from Washington. He's the Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the National Security Council. Peter, thank you very much for being here. Often, at least in the Brussels circles, when Europeans talk about the transatlantic relationship, they're usually talking among themselves and for themselves. So it's very good to have you with us to give us your perspective. We also have 2 MEPs joining us. Eva Kaili, who is a member of EU40 and is a Maltese member of the European Parliament for the centre-left S&D group. We also have Frank Begovic, who is a Slovenian MEP for the centre-right European People's Party. And then we have 2 of the sort of 2 people with a bit more skin in the game, you could say, away from the politics. Karan Bhatia is joining us from Google. He's Vice President for Public Policy and Government Relations at Google. Google has been is one of the companies in the eye of the EU's regulatory storm, so it'd be good to get his thoughts. And finally, we have Amikle Nirati, who's Senior Director for Government Affairs at Siemens. Peter, I'm going to go straight to you to give us some comments on what you've heard. I think broadly you could say that the transatlantic relationship is one of those topics that a lot of people pay lip service to, about coordination, partnerships, motherhood, apple pie. But the reality seems to be that the transatlantic relationship has come under much more strain, at least in the last 6 months and perhaps in the last 3 or 4 years, which continued back to the Trump administration. So how would you actually assess the state of play today on EU-US relations?
Well, first, let me thank you and EU40 for having me on. I think this is a very timely and important discussion, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here to offer some perspectives from the Biden-Harris administration. And I guess I want to disagree a little bit with the premise in your question, because I think the story of at least the last 6 or 9 months has really been one of rebuilding transatlantic ties, both at a government-to-government level and at a kind of commercial and people exchange level. I mean, I think, we saw with the head of state summit in June between President Biden and President von der Leyen and President Michel, we saw a real commitment to deepening transatlantic alliances. Obviously, we followed up on that summit just a couple of weeks ago with the inaugural TTC meeting. And I think we can get into the discussion, but I think there were both a number of concrete deliverables and practical areas of cooperation coming out of that, as well as a genuine will on both sides to carry the work forward. Obviously, there are some issues that continue to divide us. I mean, there's some hard bargaining going on right now around the steel and aluminum tariffs, and obviously we're also in negotiations over transatlantic data flows. But I think that the tone and context of those negotiations is one that is shaped by exactly what Mark commented on in his opening remarks, that there really is no alternative to transatlantic partnership, and we absolutely have to be united in an era where our values and our economic models are under increasing challenge from other states. And so I actually am an optimist here. I think we have seen quite a bit of strengthening of the transatlantic relationships. And while we have to be frank, there are areas of difference to work through. I think we have good mechanisms in place to be working those through.
It has been 6 to 9 months, as you say, of sort of rebooting the relationship after the strains of the Trump administration. But at least in Brussels, there are a few key decisions, you could say unilateral decisions or lack of communication that's been made by the Biden administration to its European partners. I think beginning with the deal, or at least the draft agreement for a corporate taxation agreement at the OECD, which European partners felt that they were on the back foot because they weren't entirely aware when Janet Yellen came out and said that there would be a big push on this level. Another was on patent waivers for vaccines. And then more recently, we had the AUKUS debacle, I think you could call it, given how badly it seemed to go down with a couple of countries in the European Union. We almost got to a stage where the TTC wouldn't be happening on time because at least one member state, France, was very upset about continuing with this inaugural format, given the fact that AUKUS had gone ahead and blindsided the French. Does that show that actually the transatlantic relationship and even endeavors like the TTC are still very much hostage to broader geopolitics? And actually, a lot of this stuff is actually much more fragile and shouldn't really be taken for granted. If the general optics around EU-US relations deteriorate, then we shouldn't guarantee that these formats for cooperation will exist or keep going on as planned.
Well, appreciate the direct question, and I certainly don't mean to minimize or suggest there aren't areas of friction in the transatlantic relationship. And look, as President Biden has said publicly and communicated to President Macron, we obviously need to do a good job of coordinating our actions and our announcements. But I actually think the fact that the TTC occurred sort of in the immediate aftermath of the AUKUS announcement highlights the fact there really is a ton of will on both sides to focus on the cooperative mechanism, on areas we can work together despite some areas of difference. So I actually think that yes, while there was obviously some debate within Europe about how to proceed with it and whether there'd be a short delay or something of that nature, I think the will was always there to get it done. And indeed, the fact it continued as planned, I think, reflects how much desire and commitment there is on both sides to make sure we are working constructively, even as there are some issues of difference. I mean, you brought up the tax issue, and perhaps I have a different take on that as well. I mean, that's an issue this administration has been working on, going back to shortly after inauguration. And, Secretary Yellen had said publicly during her confirmation hearings, we would be working with allies to try to reach a global tax deal. Obviously, just in the last week or two, we got 135 countries, including every member of the European Union on board with that. And I think that deal there, which could not have happened without very robust transatlantic cooperation, not only between the US and Germany and France and sort of the larger economies in Europe, but also places like Ireland and some of the Eastern European states, I think really shows that where there are these common challenges, like major corporations that are able to shift taxes offshore and not pay their fair share, we are working together. I mean, we got the deal. In getting to deals, there are always going to be differences of opinion. There's always going to be bargaining to be had. But I think if you look at the announcements that have come out, including on the tax front, what you really are seeing is at the end of the day, cooperation rather than sort of a breakdown of negotiations or desire to pursue separate approaches.
Thank you, Peter. Frank, perhaps I'll go to you. You've heard from Peter, from Mark, the Slovenian minister, that there is no alternative. You're a member of the European Parliament, where, a bit like in the European Council, there are differences about what should be the future of the transatlantic relationship. So how do you see it from an EPP perspective, but also Slovenia's perspective about the areas of cooperation or potential divergences between these two powers?
Good afternoon to Europeans and good morning to our colleagues from another side of Atlantic. I'm really very pleased that during the Slovenian presidency, EU40 organized this event, that I can participate. And I can say that I'm very happy that we changed our vocabulary. years ago, we spoke more about this, who will be first, and now we use words like cooperation, coordination, collaboration. And it's like our Minister Mark Andrianic said, Europe and the US, we are connected, we respect the same values, and it's necessary to cooperate. We saw also during the last years that many things changed around the world, and we saw in COVID crisis that we faced with absolutely new challenges we never thought or we didn't thought 2 years ago that it can happen. And thanks God through this COVID crisis, we saw what means if Pfizer and BioNTech cooperate and work together on development of vaccine. It's a one case we can say that it's necessary to use these three magic words. And in next years, for example, we speak to here in European Parliament. I'm in Brussels. This week we held a plenary. We speak about, for example, farm to fork strategy. Farm to fork strategy as part of our big Green Deal umbrella, and we speak about food security, and we need again to cooperate and work together. We started with Fit for 55 big package, which is a technological revolution for all of us, and Europe cannot do this alone, neither US cannot do this alone. So I think that here in European Parliament we really like very much that this cooperation in last year is much better, and I think that we as EPP we are all the time supporter as almost all other party for good cooperation, and also in if we look globally this geostrategic situation, we both look to the Asia, to China, to Russia, to solve these challenges together. And I think that this platform, if I can say, this platform of Trade and Technology Council is a great platform that we sit together, that we put the problems on the table, and if we sit together and we are willing to solve problems together on the base of the same values, as we said a few times today, this is the right way, and I can say that I fully support this, and I'm really very much respect this language of respect of both sides, and I think that, and I am optimist for these relations for next year, and TTC is a good platform for this work.
Thank you, Frank. Commissioner, I know we're going to lose you in a few minutes, unfortunately, so I will give you an opportunity to make some remarks, and I'll also take the opportunity to ask you a more political question. One of the big catalyzers for the transatlantic relationship, or to reboot this transatlantic relationship, is, of course, China. We've heard various different positions from different member states about how the EU should approach China. Most recently, the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire, I think, spoke to the New York Times, where he said, I paraphrase, that the US wants to confront China, but the EU wants to sort of place itself in a position perhaps between these two powers and not to seek the path of confrontation, but engagement. Do you share Mr. Le Maire's view? And more broadly, when it comes to the EU's relationship with China, how much does pressure or the particular goals of the Biden administration and its approach to China influence how you want to go about doing the same?
Well, first of all, I think that if you'd like to be able to compete with Asian region, it is important to collaborate, to have this close cooperation, and that was raised by every single participants today. And as I'm insisting, we have to connect our innovation ecosystem, because here we have very strong elements, and together we can really compete. The second, when we talk about China, I think that it's really important to preserve the dialogue, but at the same time to put very clearly on the table the respect of some principles. We all know that we are talking about level playing field, reciprocity, and that's absolutely important to be sure that when you engage, when you have a partnership, these values, these principles are respected. And that's why we know that we are actually working on our roadmap on science and innovation with China. The period is 2020-25. And I must say that here we need, again, to preserve the dialogue, but insisting on clear respect on the rules and principles and to preserve the level playing field and the reciprocity. On my side, I would like to insist, we need to strengthen our cooperation, because only by working together we can compete with others, we can really have these mutual benefits. And that's not the benefits for European Union and United States, that's for our researchers, that's for our innovators, and above all, it's for our citizens. And I think that now we have a very solid base, and we have to accelerate. We need new peace, we need concrete measures, and the engagement now is here, so it's very encouraging.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and also thank you for joining us. I think you now have to get off to your next commitment, but thank you for taking part. I don't know whether your absence will free up our guests to say a little bit more, but hopefully we can now continue with a bit more of a free-flowing discussion. Eva, let me come to you. Do you have any remarks on what you've heard so far? And in particular, I think we could get into some of the details about the TTC. The TTC will go forward with this system of 10 working groups across a wide range of areas like AI, clean technology, WTO reform, investment screening, chips. It seems that at least the working group format is one way to depoliticize a lot of these issues and also to perhaps take them out of public view. You're a legislator. I guess the meat and of your job is to understand what is being done by policymakers. How do you want to try and understand as MEPs what goes on in these formats, and how will you be able to ensure some degree of accountability and transparency about what negotiators are doing in these formats too?
First of all, let me thank you and congratulate you, because you're actually asking the right and difficult questions. And it was very interesting also for me to follow this meeting and try to see exactly how what you highlighted and how we can progress further into building these bridges again, into rebuilding, I would say, the transatlantic relations. As you will see that Europeans are more optimistic that with the Biden administration we can talk, as my colleague said, a bit more on how we can collaborate. So under the light of the pandemic, we realized what are the issues that we have to address, and also with the Trump administration, also we realized when and how we can achieve sovereignty and how we can collaborate with like-minded continents and countries. So one thing that is really important to see is that technology, especially artificial intelligence, that has been transforming every sector of our lives. They don't face, they cannot be stopped by borders. They are global, and we need to achieve at least common standards. Also with the let's say freezing the privacy shield, I would say cancellation completely, but we have to replace the privacy shield between US and EU with a new agreement that could lead us into, collaborate and exchange also data in a safe and trusted way. So since Europe has been ambitious, I would say, enough to try to regulate a bit the internet, and since we understand also that it has a very strong geopolitical aspect, the way we are planning to do that, I think that since US is maybe our closest economic and security ally, we definitely have to work together. So maybe we have a different approach in terms of respecting fundamental rights and privacy and the protection of sensitive data. But I think these are issues that we have managed to agree on and that we can develop further. How we can achieve both a balance between respect of these European values that we try to promote and also manage to collaborate technologically and in trade, because I think innovation has changed actually everything, and it's very interesting to set up this TTC, this council that would explore what are the new things now that we have to discuss and build these bridges again. Since, and this is me again coming from Europe, saying that since Europe has become a global standard setter on data privacy with the GDPR, and we have been working on the DSA and the DMA, the AI Act, the Data Act, and now expecting the CHIPS Act, I think we are trying to strengthen our foreign policy dimension on digital legislation, and also to set the rules for common rules, also for the gatekeepers. So this being a priority, I would also say that how we discuss together on our relation with China is really essential, because the discussion about the CHIPS Act came after the pandemic and the huge demand that grew suddenly, and so that we don't have the sovereignty that we need. And it takes time to plan ahead and to strengthen our capability in the chips sector, not just us, but also US. I think we have together, if we join forces, 10 and 10%, like 20% is not enough. We have at least to double that. And I think the TTC could be initially the platform to achieve this target. Of course, I understand that when we talk about the gatekeepers, I have the feeling that US thinks it's a target of Silicon Valley giants, but I don't think it is. I think it's same rules for everybody. And I think also US should have more control of global companies like that, no matter where the basis of the legislative basis is and the tax basis of these companies is. So, of course, they are under the spotlight, but still the issues that have came into our understanding and our knowledge the last years is that we cannot stay with the same rules like we did 20 years ago. So we need to have clear obligations for everybody to have more control of our data, to make sure that we have a stronger cyber defense and cyber security, and also to be able to take advantage of the benefits of this technology if we agree with the Data Act that we are preparing, if we agree on the standards to exchange industrial data. I think this would allow more access to quality data for scientists and innovators, and this would open up a whole new world of opportunities. If you consider that EU is already almost double the market of US, and the data that we generate are constant. It's not something that we have and it's how we deal with it. It's how we can generate data and how the public sector will allow access to those data. So finally, I think that the way to move forward is to also for Europe to explain through these legislative initiatives that we can balance our effort to be sovereign and to be able to collaborate stronger with our like-minded partners and not protectionists. So this is a balance that we have to keep to make it possible. In the same way, US has to decide that they will collaborate more with us, and they will understand that we need to have a policy-driven regulation for the technological and the digital era and the technological revolution, I would say, that we are facing. So we have great potential, but we have to agree on the main principles. I think this is a great effort with TTC, and the Parliament already is going to set up a visit with plenty of committees, I think at least 3, to Washington, D.C., beginning of November. After 2 years, we are resuming our activities, and this mission will have at its core the technological discussion. So we will be following very closely what TTC is going to address, and this means that I think in the end it's going to benefit citizens of both continents.
Thank you, Eva. Karen, Eva did a very good job listing the shopping list of regulations that are coming out of the EU. You do public policy and government relations for Google across the world. How much of your time is actually spent worrying about what's happening here in Brussels?
Well, First of all, thanks so much for having me, Marine, and to EU40 for convening this. Look, Brussels and Europe generally is extremely important. It's a leader from a regulatory and policy perspective. It's a significant market, and it's a significant source of innovation, I think, in the technology space. But if I can, maybe just to step back on the broader subject here of the TTC and the role that we've seen it playing, I think some of the I don't know that we have given full credit in the course of this discussion to what in fact has been accomplished here. I mean, if you step back and said 6 months ago that we would have a significant dialogue at the level at which at least the first meeting of the TTC has been convened to talk about a full array of topics, pretty much everything seemingly on the table. We're really about the intersection between trade and trade policy, which is very much a core factor, I think, in technology, which is the other component, that you would put that together, have the kind of dialogue that we're talking about, both with the goal of trying to address bilateral issues, impediments, whatever you want to call them, but also with the goal of setting a vision, setting a standard for the rest of the world, which is the rightful place, I think, for the US and the EU to be working together. I would, if that had been postured 6 months ago, I'm not sure everybody would have believed it. We at Google have been strongly supportive of it, delighted to see it come together. There's obviously a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of important issues to be talked about. Those 10 working groups, each of them is going to address topics that are of importance to not just to technology companies, but to companies in every sector and to individuals on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, the reality is, I think the pandemic, the last few years, has shown us just how important technology is in enabling our lives, not just in, enabling the kinds of innovations that we've seen to address the pandemic specifically, but also in allowing us to continue to conduct education, to continuing to conduct the economy and our businesses. Those are things that citizens on both sides of the Atlantic have come to place an enormous value on. To continue to innovate those kinds of solutions, I think, is very core to the hearts of people at Google. So I think that is absolutely critical. But there are other challenges that confront both the US and the EU, ranging from cybersecurity and the threats that we've seen that pose on both sides of the Atlantic. Climate change. We're thrilled to see a panel on a working group on climate change, because we do believe that technology and technology companies like Google are going to be core contributors to addressing those fundamental challenges. But we can't do it successfully if we are going to face a bifurcation of regulations on different sides of the Atlantic, let alone in every other country around the world. It simply doesn't become tenable. And so the mission of the TTC to try and get alignment between these two major regulatory authorities is one that we're strongly supportive of. We very much hope that it's successful. There are some significant issues, not just the ones that I mentioned, but also issues like market regulation, the content regulation of platforms, that I think also are significant issues that both sides need to come together, align on, share best practices on, and figure out how we're going to proceed on.
Thank you, Karen. I also should have mentioned that you're also a former USTR. But I just want to follow up because there are a couple of things that are, some very big issues that are outside the scope of the TTC and some which affect Google directly. Eva mentioned the DMA and the DSA, and of course, data flows, just two issues which are outside the scope of this format, but which I think are some of the defining policies which I think, as Mark mentioned, if we want a consumer-first approach to regulation, there's some questions about whether or not the EU's approach on either would benefit consumers. Just on the DSA and the DMA in particular, the idea of gatekeepers, the definition of this notion of gatekeeper seems to be squarely aimed at capturing very big companies who coincidentally or maybe not also happen to be US tech companies. We heard Eva saying that wasn't the case, but are you concerned about some of the views that you hear in Brussels and the direction in which the DMA and the DSA is being pushed in by some lawmakers when it comes to who it should capture and who it should not?
Well, let me say this, Marine. First of all, I actually was pleased to see that I think DMA and DSA were topics of conversation, as I understand it, at the TTC. And there's certainly a data governance and tech platforms working group that I know is trying to address these kinds of issues. Look, just to step back, we at Google have not resisted the notion at all of the need for regulation of both, markets and also of content online. We spend an enormous amount of time working on addressing, for instance, challenges of misinformation. We think we've got some great practices there to share on the content side. And on the market regulation side, we do think that there is the opportunity for there to be constructive engagement. I do think, I would say a couple of things in response to your direct question. First of all, I do think it has been concerning that we have seen rhetoric that would suggest that the legislation is intended to target just companies from the United States. I'm not sure that necessarily reflects the views of everyone, but the fact that there are notions implicit around that, tied sometimes to notions of digital sovereignty, I think are concerning, because we don't see this ultimately as being a solution that can just address, a nationalist solution to this is not going to be workable. First of all, there are big platforms from many different countries around the world that raise these kinds of issues. And then secondly, I think what we've been concerned about in many sectors is seeing the rise of protectionist rhetoric and translating into policy. So we do think that needs to be looked at very cautiously. But most fundamentally, we just want to make sure that the solutions that are arrived at are ones that genuinely benefit consumers. And, we've seen time and again the benefits of innovation. The competition that is driving that, I can tell you, is substantial, that exists between major technology platforms and new startups around the world. So absolutely accept the need for government to take a hard look at this space. But again, we hope they do so, A, with an eye to making sure that consumers and innovation are strengthened and benefited, and B, most importantly, that there be transatlantic discussion and coordination around this. We think that's particularly important.
Thank you. Mikle, I'll come to you now. You've heard everyone's interventions, and perhaps of the 10 working groups that we know of that the TTC will be working on, which ones will Siemens be keeping the closest eye on and will directly impact the way you do business?
Great. First of all, thank you very much for the organizers and the distinguished guests and panelists to have this very timely discussion. And I think before I focus on the TTCs, I had a chance to kind of reflect on the previous interventions made. So first of all, we all agree that the world transitions now towards the greener, digitalized international economy. I think the both sides, EU and the US, recently reaffirmed commitment in seeking new areas for convergence and the leadership are essential steps forward. So Siemens is a globally active technology company. So we stand for free trade and fair competition and level playing field that are important values for us. Therefore, of course, we welcome not only the fresh start of the transatlantic agenda, but also the TTC's establishment, and that essentially creates, as already been outlined by previous speakers, a forum, an area for a dialogue between the private and the public sector players. And when we look into the intersection between trade and technology, we often hear collaboration, alignment, cooperation, and communication as key essential areas for moving forward. So from Siemens' perspective, I mean, we've been operating on the US market for over 160 years. Therefore, not that we only welcome the TTC's creation as the initiative, but of course we're looking at the areas where the common ground and common solutions could be found. So a big focus on topics around convergence and what could be achieved in those areas. So let me just maybe focus on 3 areas out of the TTC's working groups that we're looking at very closely. First of all is collaboration defining the international ethic standards in AI. This area already been also mentioned by the MEPs and previous speakers, is the area where we really seek for collaboration not only on ethical standards side, but also on technical areas. So building a really framework for regulatory cooperation with the legislators and of course the industry. And I must be honest, we were very pleased to see also yesterday's announcement by the European Commission by establishing a public dialogue, a public open dialogue through the Futurium platform, where the industry could engage in the active dialogue and complement to the inputs in all the working groups, and not only on the working group specialized on the technology. The second area, the overall bilateral cooperation. So digital transformation we see as the key enabler to reach climate targets. So of course the group around climate goals and environment, all the climate targets laid out in the Paris Agreement, and efforts to foster investments in not only digital infrastructure but also green technologies are very much in focus also from companies' side. And finally, I mean, we've been hearing the need to seek for or strengthen the cybersecurity. And I think here I would like to spend a little bit of time to reflect that cybersecurity is a very important topic, not only for the governments, but also for companies alike. Therefore, the closer transatlantic cooperation needed to counter the cyber attacks or create more resilience organizations is essential. So therefore, from the industry side already, there are many initiatives that could be referenced as success stories. And one of them is the Charter of Trust initiative that was established in 2018 at the Munich Security Conference, with Siemens being as main initiator. And there we bring global alliance partners, bringing together many multinational companies and organizations to work together and make this digital world safer. So of course, those are the industry-driven initiatives that could be also being seen as the reflection or reference points for some of the TTC's work around this topic. And finally, we've heard innovation and R&D, and the of course the need to have a collective innovation ecosystem. So we do very much seek for the possible concrete outcomes of the work around coordinated approach on investments for 5G and 6G, as well as the investments on the R&D of 6G, but also in the area of AI, as well as education, because we do not need to forget that not only upskilling the workforces around, but also investing into our digital skills in the future will be one of the main pillars for the future. So overall, the transatlantic relations are one of the most economically integrated relationships. Therefore, the new agenda, we believe, should continuously focus on strengthening and facilitating trade and investment between the two continents. And in particular, TTC's work have high expectations, and we gladly will be contributing to the efforts of the individual working groups in those earlier mentioned areas.
Thank you, Migle. Also, I need to apologize. I introduced Eva as Maltese. She's not Maltese, of course, she's Greek. And my apologies. I don't know how I made that kind of mistake, but I deal with 27 member states here, and usually I still forget which ones are which. Sorry. Peter, I want to come to you on the notion of digital sovereignty. It's another buzzword that we're hearing more and more of in Brussels. Do you see digital sovereignty as a zero-sum game? If the EU wants to have more digital sovereignty, does that mean taking away digital sovereignty from other partners, including the US?
So I appreciate the question. I actually wanted to touch before getting to that on one of the issues that Karan was talking about, and that actually you had brought up earlier about the data flow negotiations. We had decided from the beginning of the TTC to keep negotiations over a successor agreement to the Privacy Shield arrangement separate from the TTC. They'd already been undergoing for a couple of months at that point and are undergoing. So I don't think that the fact that that was not included in the TTC is in no means a sign of low confidence in the TTC or anything like that. That was just on both sides. It made sense to keep it ongoing negotiations separate. But as Karan said, we are talking about the DMA and the DSA in the TTC, as well as with key member states and others across Europe. And I should begin by saying that Biden administration agrees with some of the sentiments coming out of Brussels that we need strong regulation of the tech sector, and that we understand and share many of the policy objectives we see being debated in Europe, such as ensuring competition in markets, helping address problems of dangerous products, misinformation online, such as fake COVID cures and that kind of thing, protecting privacy and other objectives. But as Secretary of Commerce, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo has said, there's a right way to do this in a way that could to do regulation that could ultimately stifle innovation and cause unintended consequences on both sides of the Atlantic, which is why both through the TTC and bilaterally, we've begun engagement with the Commission as well as member states on a number of specific provisions around the DMA and DSA. For example, just to make sure that as Europe moves forward with regulation, it doesn't take steps that inadvertently create new cybersecurity vulnerabilities. We already live in a world rife with cybersecurity attacks, and I think it's very important that we obviously, whether we move forward with regulation here or Europe moves forward with regulation, we want to make sure, we don't create new vulnerabilities. We want to make sure that regulatory definitions are well defined, that regulators are talking to each other, and that regulators are talking to the private sector. There's time for implementation because some of these changes will require time to implement. And of course, we want to make sure that, where only some categories of companies are being targeted, those regulations are guided by objective and sensible and non-discriminatory criteria. So, we have begun this discussion. Again, as I say, we think there are important and legitimate regulatory policy objectives, many of which we share. And I think what we have appreciated as the Biden administration is really the chance to have a very open and candid discussion about, making sure that as we also move forward with potential legislation regulating the tech sector here and Europe moves forward in Europe, we do so in a harmonized way that serves our shared objectives without creating challenges in implementation or friction between us. And so I think that really leads me to the point I want to make on the idea of digital sovereignty, which is that I think when it comes to the digital sector, there is so much more that unites Europe and the US today than there is that divides us. It's not to say we won't have differences. I just went through, some areas where we want to make sure we are not creating differences in approach. But in terms of the overarching objectives, I think there is appetite on both sides to make sure that privacy is protected. There's a huge debate here in Washington about privacy. There's appetite to make sure there's sensible regulation of the tech sector. There's appetite as we see AI, move out into tons of different sectors you saw TTC focus on AI to make sure we're working together on, appropriately understanding both the opportunities and risks around AI and taking steps together to get out ahead of them. And so, I think it's easy to sort of focus on the subset of issues that divide us, but our strategic objective in the relationship, and particularly through the TTC, is to make sure that we are also working on the areas that unite us, because at the end of the day, those are much larger than the admittedly at times quite important areas that divide us.
Just to follow up on that, do you think you talked about principles of non-discrimination? Will the EU's DSA and DMA only be credible, you think, in the eyes of the US or rival regulators if the companies that are captured by its definition of gatekeepers and market power are not just US companies, but do actually capture European companies too?
Look, I think we are in discussions with our European partners about this. I think that I'm not going to sort of offer the specifics that we're sharing with our partners on that, but as I say, I do think it's important that they be objective and sensible and non-discriminatory.
Okay, that was very well dodged. I applaud the effort. We have a question on, I guess, some of the competing philosophies. Frank, maybe I could address this at you and anyone else who wants to come in. The question is is posed: the US digital society is based upon the concept of self-regulation by corporations, while the EU is building its digital society upon laws and regulations. Does this difference in approach need to be addressed prior to rebuilding the transatlantic partnership? If yes, why? And if no, why not? Frank, do you want to come into on this point of sort of the rival philosophies around what regulation is should achieve and whether regulation is necessary at all or not?
Yeah. We have these different principles on many things, and here when we speak about this digitalization, we can see many cases where we had also in past problems or misunderstanding. I remember together with Eva Kaili, Greek members, and my surname is also Bogovic. In Slovenia, it's not easy sometimes to say, but so if you correct yourself, allow me also to correct my surname. But when we were together in Silicon Valley in Uber, and we tried to explain also different regulation of taxation and other things, American colleagues didn't understand our language, and it was good that Uber colleagues from Europe were with us so that they explained what it means, labor taxation and other things. So I think these principles are different, and for sure it's necessary to have this dialogue and try to come to common standards, common regulation where it is possible, but I don't believe that either Europe will change many regulation, either America will change and adopt European regulation. And in this platform industry, there are many problems. But I think that we can find through this dialogue about which we speak today solutions to make bridge between also this different way of thinking, different way of philosophy. And also in Europe, we sometimes speak that we are over-regulated, but on the other hand, when we speak in the level of privacy or level of disinformation, fake news, we saw through COVID crisis what it means. In my country, in Slovenia, we make a joke, or we recognize that we have a lot of Facebook doctors, not and people believe to these Facebook doctors, not to the real medicine doctors about measures and other things. So this technology and digitalization influence a lot on our life, and in last years we recognized that the role and also the need for regulation in some topics. And so I think through such a platform we created, through this council, it's possible to build bridges. But if you ask me directly, I think that this different approach will continue, but through this we can build these bridges which are sometimes necessary to work together.
Thank you. Eva, you're a legislator in the European Parliament. Brussels is one of probably the lobbying capital of Europe. There are many organizations which represent big tech. I imagine you, like many of your colleagues, will probably be targets of some of this lobbying. What do you hear from tech companies, US and otherwise, in Brussels about what they want to see from the Commission? And do you think there's still work to be done to persuade people of the merits of these huge legislative instruments like the DSA and the DMA, which are probably going to be defining this Commission's legacy when it comes to tech regulation?
Yes, definitely. We have already been discussing about the main topics that we address with DSA and DMA. We have been in contact with several of the interested members, and I think that in the end it's going to be a balanced approach. And I have the feeling also that the industry wants to have legal certainty, so it's very important to be able to say that we give more clarity into what's happening in Europe at a European level. So to give you an example, the way that you interpret GDPR per member state could actually vary. So I think we need to establish a common understanding for the gatekeepers, but also for the exchange of data at the European level to avoid the friction that could come from different member state strategies. What I think we have to agree on is that we share the same principles. So we don't want to have technologies that would create to increased inequalities or would lead to, let's say, to exclude or to have biases or to further target activists by having complete, surveillance on their activity online. And I have to give you more examples because this would actually highlight what's the point of Europe trying to have a digital framework for the future of the internet. In the US, you can have companies that they can use facial recognition, they can use biometrics to understand in public spaces who and where and why they have been there. In Europe, this has already been voted down that in public spaces we don't want to use biometrics. It remains to be seen what's going to happen for the private sector, but you understand the principle here is that we need to ensure a balance between having the best of these technologies and the benefits, but also to protect citizens and the right to privacy. You have big companies trying to even predict, but also to monitor the productivity of the workers, to understand if being too polite could risk their productivity and how they can, let's say, be faster into driving to work or into delivering packages. These are things that we don't want to see in Europe, and we don't want to have a social scoring from our governments. We want to make sure that we're going to have a human oversight of these technologies and control of these technologies. So we don't want them to replace human activity. We want them to complement humans. If we agree in these principles, I believe we can definitely work together in a much better way. And I wouldn't say again, I have to highlight that we don't talk about specific companies because they are US companies. These are global companies. They have to be able, there has to be reciprocity. We have to respect the rules of each country that they are working and they have activities. And I believe that this would give us a lot of room into finding, common ground. I can talk about this Artificial Intelligence Act because this is the file that the controversies that we have to address have not even started inside the European Parliament. We expect it to arrive the next couple of weeks in the committees. But biometrics is one core issue that we have to address, how much we want to use it and how, and then privacy. So you can use AI to have predictive policing. You can have predictive defense also, and even justice. You understand the challenges there that we face and the risks that we could have. I would also suggest that whoever is involved in these technologies, that this Black Mirror series would show us how existing technologies can be used to create these inequalities and a world with no human oversight. Also, I think we need to work together into the definition of these new technologies. So if it's possible to define AI, we should decide if we talk just about automation or with deep learning, we talk also about the autonomous systems and the super intelligent systems that human oversight is not even possible because of the amount of data that they can collect and the decisions or the solutions that they give us, they provide us with they cannot be really easily explained. So if the principle is that they should be transparent and explainable, how to achieve that is something that we can work out. But we have to agree that this is something that we have to do. Citizens have the right to know if they're talking to a bot, if they are watching a deep fake video or not. They have the right to be able to use the data that they are generating to decide to remove them on the offline. They need to be able to have them in a portable condition so that they can transfer them to other services. So these are things that we are trying to address. And of course, one of the reasons that we also talk about the gatekeepers is we also want to have competition. So we want to allow more companies to be able to give us more solutions with these technologies. And we need to make sure that when you have a dominant position in the digital era, as in the platform economy, we will also have the rules that can address this different nature of companies. And we have to also have the offline translated to online and not to allow a blurry merger of these two. So I think we know where we want to go, and we have to decide how we can move together a bit faster to create a more fair digital economy for our citizens, mainly.
Thank you. We only have 5 minutes left, but I'll get into some of the specifics. Karen, you heard Eva speaking a lot about the AI Act. The EU is obviously very preoccupied with some of these issues like algorithmic bias, biometrics, and as we heard, a lot of the dangers that come with AI technology. Do you think that there's an overfocus on the risks rather than the benefits when it comes to thinking about what an AI Act should achieve?
So, look, we have been clear that we actually think AI is a topic that does merit regulation. Our CEO came out quite early on as this process was kicking off in Europe, and was quite clear on that front, because the consequences of AI, if inappropriately deployed, are quite substantial. So we do think it is ripe for government oversight. A couple of points that I would make, though. One is, again, to reiterate the point, these are global technologies that have impact around the world. So regulation by any individual jurisdiction without collaboration, without coordination, particularly on the transatlantic front, would be not just a missed opportunity, but potentially really could set the cause back. So we would urge that. But the second, to get to your point, Marine, about the benefits here, there are enormous benefits to be derived from AI properly deployed. Solutions to climate change that we are just at the infancy of thinking about, of medicine, the ability to detect tumors and diseases early on. We at Google are proud to be investing enormous amounts of money in trying to take on these huge challenges. But it's not just those kinds of spaces as well. It's also in terms of ensuring the ongoing competitiveness of businesses. And Europe's great businesses, and I'm delighted to be on this panel with a representative from Siemens. Siemens is a great partner of Google Cloud's on the AI front to try to make sure that we are partnering with them to be able to allow for Siemens's incredible installed base around the world, incredible platforms, to be able to be at the cutting edge as it is competing globally with companies from the United States, from Asia, and elsewhere. Replicate that story 100 times over. And it's not just large businesses, it's small businesses as well that are going to benefit from these kinds of innovations. So there is a lot at stake in getting these right. It's not just a question of 5 tech companies. This is going to impact the global economy and certainly the European and US economies. So important to regulate, important to lean into this subject, but important to be extremely thoughtful and careful about what we in fact do, because it will have profound impact.
Michele, do you share Karen's assessment?
I think maybe just thanks, Marine. So maybe just to add, I mean, I do agree that cooperation and kind of finding the common grounds are crucial. But when maybe more precisely mentioning on the AI, I think transatlantic cooperation on AI needs to be not only focus on the common grounds, but also to setting very clear standards for the AI, and that must ensure that a horizontal regulations does not hinder the innovation due to the over-regulation. So that's one. And then the second is what I'm also hearing a lot is this kind of building, and also from Ms. Kalle, also from the AI regulation itself. I think we need to find those common grounds to make sure that we can work together to build a framework that for the regulatory cooperation that could be beneficial for not only the both sides of the Atlantic, but also that we can work to develop the same standards, which will then be available to be referenced by both regulations in the US and in the EU. And I think finally, maybe regarding the legal frameworks overall in the AI, we should also consider the differences between B2C and B2B AI application. That's one of the elements that is essential to reference, is to underline that the industrial AI market is posing tremendously different challenges from those in the internal market, so web AI and the others. But looking at the time, I think collaboration, cooperation, and really working on the common grounds where we can find convergency factors and where we can work together to build upon on this new momentum that Europe and US currently have. Thank you.
Thank you. We are getting towards the end, so Peter, I'm going to give the final word to you. How long should the TTC be around for, and when do we get to judge what success means for this format?
Well, thank you very much for having me on today, and it's been such a pleasure to join this very distinguished panel. I'll come to that in just a second, but first on this AI issue, it's been great hearing the comments from both sides of the Atlantic. This is exactly why we have such a focus on AI in the TTC, because it is kind of the emerging issue. It's the issue we have to get out ahead of, and we have to do it in a cooperative fashion so that we have clear and uniform regulations that let us capture the many benefits that we're going to see from AI while addressing the risks that I think we also worry about. So that's exactly why sort of the first issue in the deliverable statements out of the TTC was AI, and I think you're going to see that work stream go forward. In terms of how we measure success of the TTC, and we see this as an ongoing process. This is not a one-off meeting. It is the launch of a meeting that we expect will carry forward, not just next year, but over at least the next several years. Our measure of success is really going to be, starting at the next meeting in the spring of next year and then going into the fall and beyond. Are we able to deliver some of the kinds of concrete outcomes that people on both sides want to see? Are we able to actually come up with a shared framework for how we think about the benefits and risks of AI? Are we able to come up with an actual shared framework as we both invest tens of billions of dollars in semiconductor manufacturing for how to structure those investments? Are we able to think through how do we want to handle things like algorithmic bias in ways that protect consumers on both sides of the Atlantic and that companies can deal with on both sides of the Atlantic? So we're not going to measure success of the TTC by having one kind of big, 70-page set of commitments that's going to come out in 6 months. It's going to be an iterative process where we're going to be having concrete agreement on specific issues in the spring and the fall and the spring of the following year, and so on going forward. And I ask all the folks I've talked to about this, hold our feet to the fire on it. It's not doing us any good to have these meetings unless we are delivering those concrete outcomes. And so we're kind of looking to all of you in the press and in the audience to hold us to account to actually deliver those outcomes.
Thank you. Well, I'll plug the FT here. Anyone who's interested in developing the developments in the TTC can hopefully read all about it in the FT from myself and my colleagues in the US. Thank you very much, Karan, Peter, Eva, Frank, and Migle for being with us. Thank you very much to EU40 for having us and the Slovenian Presidency. And thank you everyone who took up their time this morning or their afternoon, wherever you are, for joining us. It's been a great discussion. I'm sure this topic is not going away anytime soon, and maybe we can do this again. So thank you everyone for joining us.